I'm really delighted to have Professor Laurent Mignon with us today. Laurent Mignon is Associate Professor of Turkish Language and Literature at the University of Oxford, a Fellow of St. Anthony's College, and Affiliate Professor at the Luxembourg School of Religion and Society. His research focuses on the minor literatures of Ottoman and Republican Turkey, in particular Jewish literatures, as well as the literary engagement with non-Abrahamic religions during the era studying the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic. He is the author of, among others, in Turkish ana metine taşınan dipnotlar, Türk Edebiyatı ve Kültürler Arasılık üzerine yazılar, footnotes moving to the main text, writings on Turkish literature and interculturalism, another one in Turkish, Hüzünlü Özgürlük, Yahudi Edebiyatı ve Düşüncesi üzerine yazılar, A Sad State of Freedom, writings on Jewish literature and thought, and Uncoupling Language and Religion, an exploration into the margins of Turkish literature. The title of his speech is The Language of Literature and Its Politics, The Case of Turkish. Please, Professor Mignon.
Thank you very much, dear Ahmet. I would like to start by thanking the colleagues at the University of Cyprus. I'm really delighted to be, well, here, even if it is only virtually today, and I would like to express my thanks to everyone, but especially to you, Ahmed, for organizing this. This is always a lot of work. So this is also for me the opportunity to reflect a little bit on what I have been doing over the last, well, almost 20 years now. And I decided to do this by focusing a little bit on the issue of the language of literature and its politics. But before doing that, I will now try to share my screen, which in the last 2 years has often led to quite a few disasters. I hope it will work this time. We'll see. So the Ottoman Constitution of 1876 is often hailed in Turkey as the first official document that recognized the Turkish language as the official language of the Ottoman state. And yet, when one looks at the actual document, one might easily be led to believe that the reference to Turkish was a little bit of an afterthought. The issue is not that the official language is only mentioned in the 18th article. That is not so unusual. The current constitution of the Republic of Poland refers to an official language only in Article 27. The Indian constitution defines the official language of the Union only in Article 343. As for the two constitutions that have arguably influenced the commission that worked on the Ottoman constitution, namely the Belgian and the Prussian constitutions, well, they do not even have an official language. No, what I find curious is that the mention of an official language happens only in a relative clause. Did my slide move? Yep. So if we look at the 18th article, I'll read it first in Turkish and then in English. Madde 18. Tebaa Osmaniye'nin hidemat-ı devlette istihdam olunmak için devletin lisan-ı resmisi olan Türkçeyi bilmeleri şarttır. So, in order to be employed in public office, the Ottoman subjects need to know Turkish, which is the official language of the state. Usually, one would expect the declaration of the official language to be the main clause or in the main clause, as would be the case in the future for the constitution of the Turkish Republic, even though here there would be some terminological shifts, but which are of no concern for us today. Now, the 18th article of the Ottoman Constitution was not the sole article referring to language. Article 57 stressed that all deliberations in the Senate and Parliament had to be conducted in Turkish. Article 68 brought in the additional condition that after the expiry of a 4-year period, I quote, knowing how to read Turkish and as far as possible write in this language, end of quote, was to become a criterion for eligibility in the parliament. Whether this new gained officialdom for Turkish was the consequence of growing Turkish national awareness, or whether it was more an expression of a certain pragmatism in the context of the centralization of the multinational, multilingual empire, is open to debate. Every constitution is the consequence of a negotiation, and this is also true regarding the language question. Indeed, in the 12th article of the earlier constitutional draft, it had been possible to read the following. Memaliki Osmaniye'de bulunan akvamdan her biri kendilerine mahsus olan lisanı talim ve taallümde muhtardır. Fakat hidemat-ı devlette istihdam olunmak için devletin lisan-ı resmisi olan Türkçeyi bilmek şarttır. So, all nations living in the Ottoman realms are entitled to learning and teaching the language that is specific to them. However, in order to be employed in public service, it is necessary to know Turkish, which is the official language of the state. This formulation in the draft had caused some concern. Inli Said Pasha, who's also known as İngiliz Said Pasha, as he had been educated on the British Isles, managed to convince Sultan Abdülhamid II that the reference to the rights of all nations to have education in their own languages and to speak their own, to teach their own languages, in the same article as the one that was declaring Turkish the official language of the state, would create the impression that the importance of other languages was equivalent to that of Turkish. He noted that in practice, people were using their own languages already, and that thus there was no need for such a clause in the constitution. Interestingly, for me at least, is the fact that it is not the syntax of the sentence about public service and Turkish that was in question. While the reference to other languages was removed, the reference to Turkish remained in a relative clause. I feel the need to open a parenthesis here. The emphasis on Turkish was not only addressed at the non-Muslim peoples living within the borders of the Ottoman state. It was also not only addressed at non-Turkish speakers. Ahmet Mithat Efendi, the famous novelist and kingmaker and occasional queenmaker in literary circles, was also quite interested in legal history, and he published extensively on the topic. In a series of articles that he published in Ittihad, the Union, the newspaper that he published and was editing, he also addressed the language question in the constitution. I quote him, "The condition that everyone should know the official language must also be applied to Muslim subjects. Among the public servants, there are so many men who are illiterate," so he uses okumak yazmak bilmeyen, and that you would not even want to employ as your servant in your home, end of quote. Hence, the problem that he refers to is not so much the ethno-religious diversity of the empire, the fact that Turkish was in practice only one language among many, but it is the question of literacy. At the time, literacy was, according to most estimates, lower than 10% of the male Muslim population. As many of you will know, Ahmet Mithat Efendi was not only an important intellectual figure and probably the most prolific writer of his age and time, but he was also a very entertaining writer. Hence, in his piece, he goes on by noting that everyone wants to become a memur, a government employee. Thus, he argued that Article 18 in the Constitution would motivate the population to become literate in the, he uses the term Ottoman language, not the Turkish language, in the Ottoman language, in order to increase their employment chances in the public service. As always, his approach is very tongue-in-cheek. Yet another remark he makes on the topic of Article 18, while equally sarcastic, reveals, however, concern for the unity of the state, while also showing a rather disturbing view of the non-Turcophone population that he seems to equate to foreigners. I quote him, "Have you noticed that those who have learned French love the French, but those who have learned German and English love the German and the English more than any other foreign nations? Hence, we can infer that once the Ottoman language becomes the language common to all people, the idea of Ottomanness will be loved by all." End of quote. Let us leave now, for the time being, Ahmet Mithat Efendi, the problem of literacy, and the question of multilingualism. But we will get back to this later. What Ahmet Mithat Efendi's discussion of the article has shown is that the language question was not an afterthought of the Constitutional Commission after all. Indeed, since the reforms of the Tanzimat, an officialization of the Turkish language had been taking place, merging concerns for the unity of the state with what we could consider democratizing aims. Now, I should stress that I am not a constitutional historian, nor am I a grammarian. However, as I said before, that the first mention of Turkish as the official language should be in a relative clause is of interest to me as a literary scholar. Indeed, in the context of our conference that looks at Turkish literature as a political platform, it is perhaps an invitation to look beyond the main clauses of the history of Turkish literature, or outside the main clauses, and thus to look at this apparent grammatical sidelining of the Turkish language as an opportunity to think about literature, language in a different way. What I propose to do in the rest of my talk today is to accept one of the premises of Turkish linguistic nationalism. I mean, the idea that linguistic Turkification policies were part of a democratizing reform that aimed at empowering the people and were fundamental in the nation-building process. But what I want to do is to read it, so to say, against the grain, in order to show that, as literary scholars, the moment we focus on the literature of Ottoman and Republican Turkey written in the Turkish language, we can actually rediscover the very cultural pluralism that the policies, or that the nationalist policies, aimed at eradicating. So first, I will look at Turkish in the early Tanzimat period, defined as the Lisan-ı Avam, the language of the mass, or the language of the ordinary people. And I will look at the call to turn this language into the language of literature. And then after that, I will look at what this means for literary historians and literary scholars, and what it means to take this call seriously. I will do this in two stages. First, by looking at the period, at the post-Tanzimat era, so covering the second half of the 19th century up to the early years of the Republic. And then in the second stage, I will look at the end of the 20th century and the early 21st century. Obviously, I will only touch upon this because we don't have that much time. So I propose to start our investigation in 1840 with the publication of a not insignificant little book, the Avrupa Risalesi, the Essay on Europe, written by a relatively little-known Ottoman bureaucrat named Mustafa Sami Efendi. A protégé of Mustafa Reşit Pasha, the architect of the Tanzimat reforms, Mustafa Sami Efendi had a bumpy career in the Ottoman bureaucracy. Its peak was arguably his appointment in 1838 as chief secretary of the Ottoman embassy in Paris. His observations during his journey to France and his stay in the French capital were to become the basis of his little book that can arguably be read as much as a reformist manifesto as a travelogue. Much can be said about it, but what matters for us today is that in the introduction of his essay, he notes that he wishes to render a service to the masses or to the ordinary people among his nation. He uses the expression avam millet, as you can see on the screen, avam milletime hidmet etmek. Moreover, a few lines further down, he explains that in order to address the avam millet, he took the decision to write the whole book in Turkish, İbarat-ı Türkiye ile İnşa, stressing at the end of his essay that very few people had written on the topic of Europe and of reform in Turkish before him. Now that is quite significant. The author, like many reformists of the era, believed that the development of the Ottoman state could only be achieved by the generalization of education. Importantly, he did not only focus on the Ottoman state, but he also talked about ordinary people in the countries that he visited, and he showed how scientific developments in various fields had contributed to the well-being of ordinary people. Of course, his vision of Europe is very idealized, but the important is that it is the Avam, including, and I would like to stress this, the disabled, that are of central concern to him. So we have here an understanding that does not simply see the reaya, the subjects, as having duties and responsibilities towards the state, but also the state, at least the bureaucracy, having responsibilities towards the reaya. And here the question of language becomes quite fundamental. Mustafa Sami does not address the question of literacy directly. The problem that the Avam are illiterate, but he evokes the need to bridge the gap between the language that is spoken, or rather the Turkish that is spoken, and the rather elaborate Ottoman Turkish prose that rendered both the language of the administration, but also the language of written literature, including the language of classical divan poetry, largely unintelligible to the majority of the Turkish-speaking population. This is a concern that was at the heart of the writings on education and reform of Ottoman intellectuals who advocated change and progress. As many of you will know, Namık Kemal, the herald of Ottoman constitutionalism, would still be asking decades after Mustafa Sami, why should forcing people to check the dictionary 80 times in order to read 2 pages be considered an expression of talent? End of quote. And I imagine that many of our students are very thankful to Namık Kemal for expressing this. In his travelogue, Mustafa Sami had praised the abundance of books on every possible subject in Europe and maintained that the language of the books was simple and understandable by most people. I quote, "Europeans have eliminated or limited the use of several unnecessary words and expressions by linking their languages to a system." End of quote. Obviously, the extent to which Mustafa Sami would have been able to assess this is very much open to debate. He confesses to his readers that he was unable to learn a European language during his stay because of bad health. Indeed, his portraiture of Europe can very much be read as a utopia, and it is unclear to what extent the author relied a little bit too much on his European informers, or whether he decided to invent another Europe that could serve as a model for reform. Meanwhile, if we get back to the question of language, he proves to be an inventive wordsmith who uses a new vocabulary to talk about a new world. He's not the only one, period. Beside the political vocabulary of the Tanzimat that we encounter in the writings of other reformists as well, in terms such as medeniyet, civilization, hukuk, law, terakki, progress, hubb vatan ve millet, so that's a tricky one to translate, love of the country and of the people, let's say, and even, and that's one that Mustafa Sami coined in reference to Belgium, devleti meshruta, constitutional state. So beside all those words, he works also like a lexicologist, defining foreign words. And he's quite creative here as well. He uses, for instance, I give a couple of examples, musée tabir eyledikleri tasvirhane, so showroom that they called musée or museum, or he uses the term, he says, büyük bey manasına granduka, so a grand duke that they call, or a büyük bey, that a great lord that they call grand duke. Quite obviously, I have to refer, being born in Belgium, I have to refer to Belgium. That's why I talk of the devleti meshruta. And since I grew up in Luxembourg, I have to refer to the grand duke. Anyway, obviously, other travelers had been there before and had faced similar challenges. However, it is worth stressing that the need of a new terminology for a new world was an important concern that went beyond travel and political writing. But of course, this language that he was coining was not the language of the Avam, the language of the ordinary people. Neither would Mustafa Sami's essay really have been intelligible to a non-educated audience. But importantly, at least theoretically, he put the Avam millet at the center of his concern, and not the Havas, not the intellectual elite and the ruling class. Education in the language of the Avam would then eventually contribute to their empowerment. That was the theory. Was Mustafa Sami influential? Not really, but the brutality of his critics suggests that his ideas had been a source of concern. But let us move on. Mustafa Sami did not specifically write about the language of literature. Yet what he wrote regarding the language of the bureaucracy and the elites was soon to be problematized in the context of the language of literature. The language of folk literature was closer to the language spoken by the people, and even though this too would deserve some discussion. So this is not so much the problem addressed by the reformists. It's more that the language of, it's a problem of the language of written and of published literature. And this is also, of course, an important development, the fact that literature is being published. This is a problem at a time when authors believed that all genres of literature had a major didactic role to play in order to promote new and, in the case of some of the writers, old ideas. It is interesting to see that it is another of Mustafa Reshid's protégés, namely Ibrahim Shinasi, who was among the first to use the concept of lisan-e-avam, the language of ordinary people, to describe the language of some of his literary works. In more ways than one, Shinasi could be seen as a writer who espoused the ideals of the Enlightenment. And I believe that it is legitimate to see his turn towards the language of the people, towards the lisan-e-avam, as part of a desire to democratize literature and knowledge. So, to a desire to empower what might perhaps become, decades later, the citizen. This concern, with varying emphasis, would be shared by many intellectuals, from the young Ottomans to the young Turks. However, beside the democratizing concern, increasingly the call to use the language of the people would take a much more nationalist tone. And here, of course, it is, and we're jumping in time, it is worthwhile looking at a central text of Turkish nationalism Ziya Gökalp's Türkçülüğün Esasları, his Principles of Turkism, which were published in 1923, though they relied on ideas and views that he had published much earlier. Ziya Gökalp, but it's interesting to look at this passage that I have highlighted for you. Ziya Gökalp went as far as claiming that Ottoman classical literature and culture were not only incompatible with the needs of the new age, as earlier reformists had maintained, but that they were un-national and had to be completely rejected on the grounds of their foreignness. Ziya Gökalp even postulated in the Principles of Turkism that the Ottomans constituted a separate class that ruled over and exploited the Turks. You see that particular passage here. I'll translate it for those among you who would like to hear it in English. So the Ottomans chose the politics of imperialism, which was detrimental to Turkish culture and life. They became cosmopolitan and placed class interest over the national interest. Truly, as the Ottoman Empire expanded and took hundreds of nations under its political hegemony, the rulers and the ruled became two entirely different classes. The ruling cosmopolitans became the Ottoman class and the ruled Turks the Turkish class. The two classes did not like each other. The Ottoman class regarded itself as the ruling nation or the dominating nation, the milleti hakime, and viewed the Turks that it ruled as an inferior nation, milleti mahkure. And this is actually quite powerful stuff and would deserve to be analyzed in the context of a decolonizing theory, actually. Now, it is, of course, a construct, but since, according to Gökalp, the Ottoman ruling class was cosmopolitan, Ottoman culture was foreign as a consequence and had to be abandoned. And so the origins of Ottoman classical music were Byzantine, and Ottoman music was archaic, ill, and foreign, writes Gökalp. Ottoman literature too, but especially poetry, because of the use of the Aruz metrical prosody, borrowed from the Iranians, was alien. Indeed, the language of literature was, I quote Gökalp, as artificial as Esperanto, end of quote. Throughout his essay, Ziya Gökalp listed foreignness and artificiality side by side with backwardness in order to condemn ruthlessly the Ottoman tradition. He advocated a return to folk culture where what he called true Turkishness had been preserved. So folk music, folk literature, and the spoken language, at least the tongue spoken by the ladies of Istanbul, were to be among the founding stones of a new culture and literature that was truly national. They are not the only founding stones, though. Indeed, a few years earlier, Gökalp, together with Ali Canip, had written a piece in Genç Kalemler, Young Pens, a journal that had become the meeting place of the nationalist intelligentsia, that the language issue was of vital importance for the Turks because, I quote Gökalp and Canip, rebellions are made with the sword, but the revolution that is brought about by the rebellion is completed with the pen, end of quote. Of course, this populism did not go uncriticized. Among those who opposed it was the poet Nigar Hanım, who expressed her dismay in an interview to the journalist Rushen Eshref on the democratization of the literary language. I quote her, "I believe that Persian genitive and adjectival constructions should be kept," means in the Ottoman literary language. "The elite should not be lowered to the level of ordinary people." Here we have again the concept of avam. "Ordinary people should be raised to the level of the elite. If this is not possible, then let there be a literature for ordinary people, but this should not have any influence on the literature of the elite," end of quote. Now, her views have often been dismissed of those of an Istanbul salon holder of Hungarian aristocratic background, and thus seen as a confirmation of Gökalp's views that pitted an Ottoman elite against the Turkish nation, which was very much also the discourse in the early Turkish Republic, even especially among the Kemalists. However, it is worthwhile looking at Nigar Hanım, because I mean, it's worthwhile looking at Nigar Hanım as someone, as an upholder of an Ottoman linguistic cosmopolitanism that could be synonymous with cultural and political pluralism. But that's perhaps something for a discussion later. But let us take Gökalp and other nationalists at their word. So folk literature was, of course, an oral tradition. So if we are to follow the nationalists, engaging with the Turkish language folk tradition, with what Gökalp called the living museum of the people, well, this will uncover a diversity, dare I say, a cosmopolitanism that was very different with what he and other young pens had in mind. As one of the poles in the debate on national literature dealt in particular with the problem of authenticity and the rejection of Persian and the later post-Tanzimat French influences, the idea that Turkish folk literature, or folk literature in Turkish, the depository of authentic Turkish values, according to Gökalp, was a cultural hybrid merging Turkish, Armenian, Greek, and Kurdish influences, was not welcome in the age of nation building. And yet, among the itinerant bards that roamed Anatolia before 1915 were the Armenian Ashuks. It was common for itinerant Armenian bards to perform in more than one language, such as Armenian, of course, but also Azerbaijani, Georgian, Kurdish, Persian, and Turkish, and the various dialectical variants in accordance to the region of origin of the Ashuk. Armenian Ashuks had a considerable number of Turcophone Muslims in their audience, as orality defeated the high levels of illiteracy. Notably, the Ashuks shared a common repertoire with the Turkish Muslim Ashuks, which included epics such as Köroğlu and Kerem ile Aslı, poems and folk songs. They appealed to an audience, bridging ethnic and religious divisions, also by performing personal compositions that followed the rules of both Turkish classical, so aruz, but also of folk prosodic hece. In her memoirs, the Armenian novelist and short story writer Zabel Yesayan remarks that her grandfather Hagop, who was an acclaimed folk poet, was very much appreciated by a Muslim Turkish audience. Based on information that she had gathered as a young woman, she writes that, I quote her, "The Turks held him in such high regard that many hoped to become his students. From what I have heard, my grandfather used to write down his songs in Turkish with Armenian letters." Now, we know that such gatherings were far from extraordinary. In a study on the institution of the Semai Kahve, the coffee shops where bards performed, the ethnologist and literary scholar Mehmet Halit Bayre notes that some of those coffee shops were actually owned by Armenians, and they encouraged the participations of Ashuks as well as Ashuks. Now, Zabel Yesayan referred to her grandfather writing down his songs in Turkish in the Armenian script, a reminder to scholars of Turkish literature that if they are to focus on literature written in Turkish, especially in the post-Tanzimat era, they will engage with a multi-scriptural world. For Turkish literature was produced in not less than 5 distinct alphabets, and you see some of them here. There is, of course, the Perso-Arabic, the one we call the Ottoman alphabet, but also 4 other ones that were not the less, and not any less Ottoman, namely Armeno-Turkish, in which the first novels in Turkish were written, Karamanlı, so Greco-Turkish, in which Evangelinos Misailidis penned his novel Temaşa-i Dünya, the observation of the world, in Syro-Ottoman, which is not represented on this slide. Syro-Ottoman is Turkish in the Syriac script, and Judeo-Turkish, which is Turkish in the Hebrew script. But Syro-Ottoman and Judeo-Turkish are of less importance in the development of modern Turkish literature. As I have written elsewhere and repeatedly, I'm not convinced by the argument that alphabets, which were undeniably identity markers, constituted an obstacle to intercommunitarian exchanging or exchanges and intercommunitarian reading, let's say. Indeed, when we look at the autobiographic writings of some of the major literary figures of the time, from Ahmet Ihsan was the editor of the most important literary magazine at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, Servet-i Fünun, to Zabel Yesayan, who we've just seen, or from the Judeo-Spanish novelist and publicist Elia Carmona, to Khalid Zia, the author of Ashk Memnu, I'm sure a work that many of you will know, Forbidden Love. So without forgetting, of course, our good friend Ahmed Mithat, we find evidence in the autobiographical writings that different alphabets were not an obstacle to consume literature in Turkish. So one could argue that a focus on the Turkish tongue reveals indeed the very type of cultural, that is to say, ethno-religious diversity, and indeed the political pluralism that nationalists wished to erase. And perhaps it is also our role as literary scholars to show this. Indeed, literary scholarship is as political as literature. But let us make a jump in time and move to the end of the 20th century and the early 21st century, an age that is the product, among others, of the genocides, the massacres, and the deportations that have characterized the last years of the Ottoman state and the birth of new nation states. As this type of diversity that existed in the post-Tanzimat era disappeared? The answer is no, of course, and it is probably more political than it has ever been, as authors writing in Turkish throughout the first century of the Turkish Republic challenged again and again the type of linguistic engineering, the homogenization of the written language, and the policy of purging it of non-Turkic elements that was promoted by the Türk Dil Kurumu, the Turkish Language Institute, in the early years of the Republic until the end of the 70s. But today, of course, we could argue that the use of Öztürkçe has become a challenge to the new TDK, to the new Türk Dil Kurumu, and to the new Turkey as a whole. So it's getting a new significance, a new meaning. Now, I will not address the latter point, but get back to an earlier period, as I think that novelists such as, to quote, Yaşar Kemal and Latife Tekin, for instance, to name but two whose works have been translated in several languages and are very well known outside of Turkey. Not only does the language of the narrators and characters in some of their writings challenge the type of language promoted by the institutions of the state, but they are also full of references to the linguistic diversity that continues to survive in Anatolia and in Turkey generally. Authors such as Yaşar Kemal, of course, but also Seyit Alp and others who not only fused the Turkish epic tradition with the novel form, explored Kurdish issues and experiences, but also worked on a narrative language that defied standard Turkish. In Turkey, Yaşar Kemal is perhaps the most prominent case. He was, and undeniably still is, still was until recently, an author who wrote back to the center, which is here Ankara, the political capital, but also Istanbul, the cultural capital. And by doing so, he introduced Eastern Anatolian and Kurdish culture within Turkish literature into the debate. Kemal's approach directly challenged the Turkish state that denied the existence of the Kurdish identity during a long period. His poetic prose, which often integrated vocabulary and Turner phrases directly from the Çukurova region into standard Turkish, challenged the nationalist discourses on language. But more than in the domain of prose, it is in the domain of poetry that such developments could be witnessed in the early 21st century. One of the most interesting literary phenomena in Turkey in the early 21st century had been the emergence of a group of poets who had been referred to as Kurdish poets writing in Turkish, Türkçe yazan Kürt şairler, in the poetry periodical Yasak Meyve, beautiful name for reading fruit, that devoted a special issue to the topic back in 2004. It was entitled Doğudan Zuhur Eden Şiirler, Poems Rising from the East, and introduced and discussed the works and views of Mehmet Butakın and Metin Kaygalak. It was a milestone, one of the earliest attempts to take this new movement seriously. The socialist writer and political activist Sezai Sarıoğlu edited the volume, and it included his enlightening introduction, proposing some new concepts to make sense of this new body of work. From a literary point of view, the work of this group of poets is characterized by the narration of Kurdish culture in Turkish, the bending of the rules of the Turkish language, the use of sentences in broken Turkish that integrate Kurdish usages. In the terminology of post-colonial theory, one could be speaking of an appropriation of the Turkish language that bears the burden of another experience. The linguistically subversive dimension of some of these verses, the attempt to create a new literary language by Kurdifying Turkish, shows indeed that literature in Turkish, more than ever, offers a wide range of linguistic forms that defy homogenization. I just said literature in Turkish and not Turkish literature. This allows us to switch the focus, perhaps, and it's a debate still ongoing, from the ethno-nationally demarcated concept of Turkish literature, Türk edebiyatı, to a language-centered understanding of literature in Turkish, Türkçe edebiyat, which enables the discussion of a wide range of texts written in Turkish, but of authors who might not have necessarily defined themselves as Turks, yet used the Turkish language in their work. Of course, this is a way for me to salute Mehmet Yaşın, one of the sons of this island, who started the debate on the use of Türkçe edebiyat and Türkçe şiir in a series of articles which he published between December 94 and September 95 in Adam Sanat, one of Turkey's leading cultural magazines of the time. Since then, the debate has been regularly rekindled, not the least in the context of discussions led by Kurdish authors and poets writing in Turkish. This is indeed an important reminder then that here in Nicosia, we are in a great place to discuss the politics of literature in Turkish. Thank you very much.